Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. For any of you who have been listening to this show for some time now, know by this point that I am a big fan of cannabis and its abilities, when used consciously and responsibly, to act as a tool for self-development. From self-development, we can gain self-awareness. And from self-awareness, we can gain self-realization. And for me personally, self-realization is the ultimate goal of my life. This being said, I get a lot of questions about cannabis and women's health. So this week, I'm bringing you straight to the source and found the expert who's been studying cannabis and women's health for over a decade. She has 18 years of knowledge of the pharmacology and health effects of cannabis on a woman's body throughout all stages of life. I'm happy to report that she also has a deep dive educational course to share called the Green Woman's Guide to help with any woman in your life who are canna curious. You'll find a link to the course and a 25% discount code in the show notes when you use the code Highly Optimized at checkout. And my hope is that any women listening to this episode who are looking for a woman-specific approach to cannabis are able to do so and feel confident in their choice to connect with the plant. So please, help me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Sexton onto the show. Michelle, such a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, and like I said in the intro, I'm so excited for this because I do a lot of work with cannabis, yet I'm a male, right? So a lot of women that listen to this, show, they're looking for this type of approach, right? And no matter how much I might learn about it, I'm not a woman, right? So I can give the info, but you have the direct experience. Not only that, but you've also been doing this for a very long time with women. And so what I'd love to figure out from the get-go is what got you into this type of work, right? Especially being in cannabis as long as you have been. Many people might think about cannabis as like, oh, it's everywhere now. But even 5 years ago, it was a very different world. So especially talking 10 or 18 years ago, very different world. So how did you get into this?
Well, my beginnings go pretty far back to my granddad, who was a general practitioner, medical doctor who had, just a family practice where we grew up. So I think that I was always interested in health. And then around the age of 17 or 18, I just had a strong knowing that I wanted to work with women. And I wasn't sure what that was going to be, but I found the book Spiritual Midwifery, which was written by Ina May Gaskin. She's the modern mother of midwifery in our culture. And I read her book, and I knew that I was going to be a midwife. And it didn't happen right away, but I did eventually become a midwife. And so a very natural extension of being a midwife was also being an herbalist. So I got my herbal certification. That was with a teacher named Rosemary Gladstar. She's been teaching herbalism for a long time. She's from the Northeast, Vermont or New Hampshire, I think. And so, very strong interest in botanical medicine. And yet I had no understanding of what makes a plant a medicine. That was just like my burning question. And because I had never learned any chemistry, thus the question. I eventually went back to school to study horticulture because my goal at that point had been that I was going to have a medicinal herb farm and, maybe create products. So I went back to school and met this wonderful teacher who introduced me to the world of phytochemicals. And so that was really the turning point for me to understand this vast world of plant-based chemicals that, we don't need to survive, that they're not nutrients to our body, but they interact with our biology. And that's what makes a plant a medicine, are these, we call them secondary plant metabolites. And I remember when I was in my horticulture degree, I was almost 40 years old when I went back to school. And I remember one of the young kids, probably 22, that was graduating, and I was 38 or 40. He asked me about studying cannabis. And I said, well, that's a great question. I guess you would just have to try to find someone in the, academics that's doing this. I didn't know of anyone. Well, I moved to Seattle to start my naturopathic medicine degree at Bastyr University. And I had become involved in research, and I wanted to keep doing that. And so I was going to look into growing a type of immune cell that lives in our brain. They're called microglia. And so I literally went to Google, I typed in microglia, and the top hit that I got was a lab at the University of Washington, Dr. Neffy Stella's lab, and he was studying the endocannabinoid system. I reached out to him to learn about microglia, and that ended up in a 6 years of working in his lab and just being very immersed in cannabinoid pharmacology. So it was all sort of a serendipitous chain of events that I never set out specifically to study cannabis, but that's where I ended up.
That's so cool. And I talk about often how I really feel as though the plant calls upon people. And it does it in interesting ways, because some of the people that I know that work with cannabis do not actually consume cannabis whatsoever. A lot of the growers I know, they're just really called to grow the plant. They don't really know why. They can't quantitatively say what brought them there or logically say what brought them there. And so for you, it really sounds like you were following the breadcrumb trail from what some people might call your heart, right, or your soul. Something just lit you up. Something said, go here. You said, okay. You went there. You found this thing. You did this search, right? So what I love to dive into in people's stories is the more and more episodes I've done on both of my podcasts and the more people I meet, the amount I realized that even for me, very similar, I, especially when I got out of the cannabis industry, thought that I was going to leave not cannabis behind. I always loved growing, and it was a very fun, thing in my life, but I didn't see it really moving forward into this next chapter of my life. And then it was through going to retreats and meeting all of these amazing individuals that were always way more curious about what I was doing with cannabis than to hear any other aspect of my life, that I started going, okay, what if I meant to bring cannabis into the psychology and coaching realm? And as soon as I started asking that, all of a sudden the universe started giving me these clues, right? These really good signs that I was getting warmer or closer to something. Now, what that something is, I don't really know, and I don't know if I'll ever know, right? But at the end of the day, it feels good. And I think that's a huge part of it, is that, if we follow what feels good to us, and again, what feels good to each one of us is subjective, right? It doesn't mean that it's objectively a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, for some reason, we're called here. And so I love that about your story, is that you follow that clue and here you are. It's really cool.
I brought together my passion to serve women, which I did as a midwife for about 10 years. But I wanted to be able to expand on that. And so that's what naturopathic medical school, allowed me to really deepen my toolbox, become become better at diagnosing, women are complex, I probably a lot of the men listening would agree. And, our biochemistry is a little more complex, and that affects everything. It affects how we interact with drugs, or drugs affect us. We know that there's differences between male and females, and experiences with THC, tolerance to THC, so there's a lot of things to dive into.
Yeah, it's so cool you bring that up. And I promise I'm not just saying this because you're here, but I truly feel women are the stronger gender. The things you guys go through is, I'm so grateful to be a man, right? I watch what my girlfriend goes through. And so I don't say that lightly. That is something I've said in many different episodes before. And, that's why it's so important, because, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but we live in a world that's very masculine dominated, but it's not even really true masculinity. It's, let's just say, an interesting form of it, right? To talk very lightly about it. But, I think it's so important to have women-specific things the same way that it's important to have male-specific things. That's why I love, seeing this whole men's work, women's work come out, right? Women have their circles and their retreats they do, and men have their circles and retreats they do. And then we can come together, but it's so important to have those things separate as well. because we do operate on such different systems. And yet we're all human beings all souls having a human experience, but at the end of the day, like, we do differ in certain ways. And one thing I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure we'll dive into this, moreover as well. What are some of like the stark differences you've noticed between men and women interacting with cannabis? And I know this is probably a big rabbit hole, so take this wherever. You can talk about it as little or as much as you want, but what are some of the bigger differences you've seen that maybe someone listening might not have been aware of before? I know you talked about tolerance, and what I found through my own anecdotal evidence working at a dispensary was that women more often than not could handle a lot more cannabis than men. Now, I don't know if that's objectively true. Again, it was just my own anecdotal little evidence I saw from a lot of patients coming in, but I'm curious to hear any of your things you found through your actual research too. Men and women differ in when it comes to cannabis.
Well, I think it's always a challenge to generalize. I know that there is data suggesting what you said, that women may have a higher tolerance to THC. That said, there are always exceptions. There's men and women who have very low tolerance to THC, but probably, what is behind this is estrogen, and, specifically how estrogen rises and falls across a woman's monthly cycle. And so, different women are going to produce different amounts of estrogen. But one thing we know is that around the ovulation time, there's a bit of a spike. And what's also associated with that spike in estrogen is a spike in our endocannabinoid anandamide. And so it may be that having more of that circulating endogenous compound has some role in a female's ability to, tolerate a higher dose of THC. There's also been differences shown in pain measurements, that women may experience more pain relief than men. These are, I wouldn't say they're 100% conclusive, but I think probably the hormonal fluctuations are probably the biggest driver behind the differences that we observe or that have even been measured in research.
Hey everybody, I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
That's amazing. And I love, the caveat, because this is the great thing with science, right? Like, this is the best information we have so far, but we know throughout looking in antiquity that science changes pretty frequently, right? And, that's why I love what you're saying, like, this is what the research shows now, because that's how I always say, I'm like, I could be totally wrong on everything I say, right? But right now the science suggests this, and so I love that caveat too, because I think that right now we live in an interesting realm where science is kind of taken as this objective thing that doesn't change. And I think anytime we can throw in there the fact that, like, hey, science is the process of ever evolving and testing something until we prove it wrong. And then when we find our new quote unquote answer, we test it until we find a point that it breaks again, if it does, right? Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does. And so I love that caveat as well. And, something that I would love to dive into too is, and this might be another big rabbit hole here, but this is something that I've been hearing a lot of talk about recently. I don't know if you've heard the new Andrew Huberman episode, where he kind of ranked on cannabis quite a bit. And again, he's a Stanford researcher, teacher, educator, great guy. I love his work. But personally, when I listened to the episode, I thought he made a lot of claims that, were not exactly conclusive, and also that left out some outlying, things that could have been causing these findings. So one of the things he was mentioning was cannabis and pregnancy. Now, the study I looked at was from Jamaica. It was from a little while ago. You might be familiar with it. And I forget exactly what it was saying, but it was basically saying that there was some good that could be done with cannabis and pregnancy. Now, Andrew Huberman was going on the counter argument of that, saying there's never a good time to use cannabis during pregnancy. What would you say with regards to that? And I imagine, again, this might be a big rabbit hole, so feel free to take it wherever.
I would agree that it could be a rabbit hole. First, I just wanted to address the Jamaican study. And so I think, we have to keep that in context, this is within a culture, where cannabis was a part of the culture. And I think sometimes what might get left out of that story is that culturally, women tended to discontinue cannabis use during pregnancy in Jamaica. And they somehow had an inner knowing that it was something to leave off. And also that men were more likely to be smoking cannabis than women. So if women used cannabis, they were more commonly using it in a tea form. So that's a huge difference in terms of the dose, potential dose of THC that they were getting. And so, I think there's some female wisdom there that could be left out of that story, could have been left out of that story as it's passed down for, several decades now. What has evolved since that time is this definition and exploration into our endocannabinoid system. And because that cannabinoid receptor is so highly expressed in the brain, it's been of interest to, neurobiologists who are studying how the brain develops. And so we know that from the very early time of embryonic development that the endocannabinoid system is already active in the developing brain. And that one way that it's active is, these neurons are forming networks. So they're getting called out and making connections, in different parts of the brain. And anandamide is one of the compounds that's calling the neuron out to where it's supposed to go. So you have that cannabinoid receptor, the anandamide over here, and it's drawing the neuron into its pathway. So I think the big question is, what happens then if the mom is using cannabis and there's THC crossing the placenta, getting into the embryo and the development of the central nervous system, and then you put something outside, that has an effect on this biology, what are the consequences? And I think that's still the big question today, because I think the questions that have been somewhat answered are that, it's not what we call a teratogen. It's not causing physical malformations like some drugs can do. It doesn't, like the Jamaican study, she didn't measure like that the infants seemed, distressed or there was any, behavioral differences between babies whose mothers had used cannabis and those who hadn't. So, in the early neonatal period, there's still questions about whether or not it could affect birth weight. It may depend on if a mother is smoking, because we know that smoking is going to affect birth weight. But I think what the neurobiologists are thinking about at this point, and Yasmin Hurd is someone who's studying this, is what are the potential neurodevelopmental effects a little later. So there are starting to be some data suggesting that children may be more susceptible, like to ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when they get into school. And even further out than that, in young adulthood, there's been some associations made with potential mental health problems. So, I think these are the things that we're not going to know for a while, right? Because cannabis is really just now bursting on the scene in a big way. And it's going to take a generation or so, to be able for epidemiology to really measure these things. So, I was a midwife and I'm a naturopathic doctor, which I think means to a lot of people that maybe I'm anti-medicine, but I'm not. I'm more integrative and kind of middle of the road, like, there's good stuff all around and how can we use it wisely? But my approach has always been no drug in pregnancy is the best approach. And that's, that's if you want to be 100% cautious. And then I just to add one caveat to that is to kind of bring in trauma and anxiety, because, this is something that I think we all have to be thinking about with what's going on with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and how, this anxiety around what's going to happen if I get pregnant for women. There's other things that women often are dealing with when they get pregnant, such as, they may or may not have a partner. So there's financial stress. There's, lack of social support. We know all of this data coming out about women of color, that they're more susceptible to problems in pregnancy, probably because they lack resources, right? Not only financial resources, but these social network resources. If a mother is in that situation and she has this activated hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, and she's pumping out cortisol, this is affecting the baby's neurobiology and development also, right? And so, if cannabis is a mediator in that cycle to help the mother, in this chronic anxiety situation and combat that negative piece of neurodevelopment, is one worse than the other. Yeah. I think that, we have to remain open-minded and yet cautious, especially about the developing brain.
Yeah. I love that you went over that, because that's exactly where I fall when it comes to anything with cannabis. I'm like, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? So Andrew Huberman was showing that if you interact with cannabis before you're 25, there's maybe a change in gray matter, all of these things. But at the same time, if you're someone who's connecting with a plant, say consciously, responsibly, with a good intention, you're also getting cannabis that's clean, because one of the things he didn't talk about is what was the quality of cannabis that people were interacting with during these studies. Was it sprayed with glyphosate? Was it grown organically? Was it grown with salt-based nutrients? I mean, there's so many things that the point I'm at is very similar to you. I'm like, there's going to need to be a lot of research done before we can ever really essentially have a correlation equal a causation when it comes to cannabis. But that's where I go, is very similar to you. I'm like, okay, so for me, I help a lot of people break patterns of dependency with cannabis, right? And so essentially, it's not that they're waking up and deciding that they want to get addicted to cannabis. It's that cannabis is providing some feeling of comfort to them that is really good for them when they're living in discomfort. Now, by good for them, I don't mean necessarily that the pattern is good, but it's providing them some sort of relief. So my whole thing is, let's figure out why you're getting drawn to externalize feelings of comfort onto the plant, figure that thing out, and then remediate your relationship to cannabis so you can actually start tuning in with it rather than tuning out. And the thing is when you start tuning in with it and you start actually diving into emotional, mental awareness, things like this, generally people end up using less because they know what's going to come up during that experience is probably going to be challenging. It's totally different than tuning out. And I'm not here to say whether tuning in, tuning out is better or anything. It's just awareness that I talk about. But, when it comes down to it, a lot of people have had really severe childhood trauma, and so those things can, just like you were saying, release cortisol, adrenaline, all of these, challenging things in the body that produce inflammation and all of these things. If someone is mitigating that with cannabis, what's the bigger risk? And I don't know the answer, but these are the questions I ask is it as easy as saying cannabis is objectively bad or, not good to use before you're 25, or is it situational? And that's the answer. I have no idea, but, what my intuition leads me to is the fact that nothing is objectively good or bad. It's just how we interact with it and how we connect with it. It's almost like, water is essential to our lives, yet if we drink a gallon in under 5 minutes, we will probably drown ourselves, right? Food is amazing, yet we know a lot of us overeat, right? And eat bad foods and things like that. But I think it really comes down to education and awareness. And I think that, one thing that women are really good at is intuition. And so just like you were saying, right, a woman's intuition really knows, right? And in these matriarchal societies throughout antiquity, there was this whole concept of a woman's intuition. And I think that's been lost in a lot of ways to the more masculine way of, let's just look at the science, which again, I think science and what you could call spirituality in this case are two sides of the same coin. And I think we need to entertain both of them and then try to figure out, how they come together. because that's what alchemy, I think, really got right back in, throughout antiquity, is it was kind of like science and spirituality were seen as two sides of the same coin. And I think that, you do a really good job of splitting that science and spirituality of like, well, hey, there's science currently showing this, but also in the past, science has shown lobotomies were great, right? Until they weren't, So we don't know right now. But at the same time, I love to bring awareness to this stuff, because I think that the more education we put out there, the more someone will be able to have the education to be able to use discernment in his or her life to be able to decide, okay, is cannabis right for me? Because I do think that cannabis brings great power, but with great power comes great responsibility. And it's up to us to be our own gurus first and see like, okay, separate from what the science is or anything, how do I feel when I interact with it? Am I being led to this to escape? Am I being led to this for like a general curiosity that I want to dive into? But I think it is multifaceted at best, for sure.
Yeah. And you were talking about something that made me think about dose, because, when we, in medicine, we consider for medical purposes that THC may have what we call a narrow therapeutic window, that, there's sort of a narrow dose where you're going to get the best benefit. And that fits with a concept known as hormesis. And this fits with the endocannabinoid system because it is a system of homeostasis. So just as an example, vitamin D deficiency and vitamin D toxicity have similar symptoms, almost identical. So, there's somewhere in the middle where you get the right dose of vitamin D, where your bones aren't too weak or not too brittle, or, the negative effects coming on. So with THC, it's the same thing, because it's directly modulating our endocannabinoid system. And this is very important for women's health, because the endocannabinoid system is regulating ovulation. It's very involved in implantation of the egg if it gets fertilized into the uterus. And one way that, heavy cannabis use can affect women and men is in the brain, in the hypothalamus, the release of a compound called luteinizing hormone. And so that affecting luteinizing hormone with heavy cannabis use may be down-regulating the endocannabinoid system, so that it's not keeping all of these chemicals in their appropriate windows, so that, there can be associations made with infertility for women who are using cannabis very heavily. And that mirrors that when women are undergoing in vitro fertilization, women with very high anandamide levels are less likely to achieve a pregnancy. So, it gets kind of complex. So I was just thinking of this concept that I've been developing of, if you want to tone the endocannabinoid system, you really want to use like dietary cannabinoids that are not THC. And if you're going to use THC, that it's used like milligram or less doses, maybe, for some people. And then there's this whole process of let's just hack the system. I've got extreme anxiety. And, when you're in a state of that kind of anxiety, you can't really do anything for yourself to like heal yourself. So you need a hack to just get the anxiety out of the way so that you can move on to your healing. But then you go even higher in dose and you're actually down regulating the endocannabinoid system. So, yeah. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking was informed consent. And, it's a big thing in medicine, for patients to be able to make a choice about having a surgery or not, or taking a drug or not. You need all the information, like what are all the side effects? What are all the potential benefits, so that you can weigh those. And I think sometimes, in this furor around cannabis and this cannabis renaissance, we can get caught up in, it's just so great for everything, so there is some balance needed. And that's what I want women to be fully informed so they can make informed decisions about their health.
You and I both, Michelle, this is really why I do what I do, because working in the industry and of course being in the world of cannabis for the last 12 years, cultivating and, doing a lot of the pharmacology and these kind of things, what I realized right off the bat was that a lot of the culture is a little toxic, right? Like if you took out cannabis and put alcohol or nicotine or any other drugs in, someone would call you an addict, right? But in the cannabis industry, right, in the cannabis world, it's like smoke it all day. It won't give you cancer. Like that's like literally what a lot of bud tenders tell people to come in. And what I would do is sit there and tell them like, hey, there are certain consequences, even if you just look at like emotional regulation, mental acuity, things like that, that do come forth as a result of overusing cannabis. There's also like for sleep, REM sleep, we know is affected negatively by interacting with cannabis close to bedtime. And so like there are these things where, again, I'm not here to tell someone what's right or wrong, but like you said, informed consent. If someone understands the full picture, not just smoke it all day, you can't overdose, right? Like that doesn't really give people a lot of information. If someone actually understands the potential risks and the potential benefits, they can then use their own discernment muscle to figure out, is this plant actually something I want in my life? And if so, in what quantities, on what structure, what discipline, what frequency, and what components are going to help me? Maybe for some people, they never interact with Delta-9 THC or any other intoxicating component of the plant. The one thing that I do like about having some amount of THC in there, which can be a very small amount, is just the entourage effect, right? But we can get that from hemp flower, which has 0.3% of THC or under, where we're still having the plant work as the plant was intended, but we're not having those either psychedelic or even psycholytic experiences like we were talking about before we hit record. Because I do think that Jamie Wheel talks about this in his new book where he goes, okay, let's say that there are 10% of people that should just never do any psychedelic whatsoever, including cannabis, right? Like let's just say for whatever reason, maybe schizophrenia, psychosis, whatever it is, their brain is not meant to interact with anything intoxicating. Then let's say that there's 10% of people that are true like psychonauts that really just love exploring and it works well in their body. Well, there's about 80% in the middle of that that might benefit from maybe one, maybe two psychedelic experiences in their life. And with cannabis, this could be something high dose. It could be any other type of psychedelic. But maybe these people would benefit from that at a certain point in their lives. But I think until we start actually figuring out, especially through epigenetics, if people have predispositions, like in the AKT1 gene, to schizophrenia and psychosis when interacting with cannabis, again, it's like informed consent. That's like the biggest thing right now. That's why it's so fun you brought that up. Because for me, I tell most people when they hit me up and they go, hey, should I interact with cannabis? I go, I have no idea. You should probably take an epigenetic test or a DNA test, figure out how your endocannabinoid system is wired, figure out if you have predispositions, and then be able to make your own choice based on the data. And I don't think that everything needs to be that science heavy, but I do think that when we're working with things that can potentially bring forth schizophrenia, psychosis, things that I think I can say for all of us listening, we would rather never experience, then it is important now that we have the information available to actually go forth and use it. Because let's face it, this information is very new, right? Like even 10, 20 years ago, we kind of just had fingers crossed that we didn't have that predisposition and just figure it out by trial and error. Now we have ways in which to reduce that harm. And I think that for me, harm reduction, minimum effective dosing, and just being honest with yourself about why you're looking to interact with the plant are the top three things I tell everyone. Because if you can at least work through those things, then you know that you're going to have a much better chance of doing more good than harm with the medicine. Because at the end of the day, anything can be a medicine or poison depending on how we use it in our experience of life.
So I wanted to back up because you made a couple of comments about sleep a minute ago. And women experience a lot more sleep difficulty than men.
Yeah, for sure.
There's different sleep problems, but just general insomnia. And because women also experience more anxiety type of disorders than men, this can have a very negative impact on sleep. Sleep can vary for women across their menstrual cycle because estrogen it can almost be psychoactive in itself. If the ovaries are not responding to signals from the brain, follicle stimulating hormone can act upon the adrenals and induce anxiety. And this is something that happens during the perimenopause. So before women ever start seeing a change in their monthly cycles, so they may still just be cycling along regular as ever, there's already changes going on in the brain. The perimenopause transition is starting before this physical symptom emerges. But the physical symptom that emerges earliest and most often is sleep difficulty. And so you made a comment that using cannabis before sleep interferes with REM sleep. So that was specifically what I wanted to address. The data on cannabis and sleep is small. What you are citing was from the early 1970s. And I think that's, back then, I mean, we hadn't even had THC very long in isolation, to be able to study it, maybe a decade. And so then, all we had was people smoking cannabis, and wasn't really medical research going on. They would just bring cannabis smokers into a hospital setting and measure a bunch of stuff, right? Or they would administer THC. So the doses that they were administering for sleep at that time were between 30 and 50 milligrams of THC. And so back to this concept of hormesis, where a low dose of something versus a high dose could do completely opposite things. That's called biphasics in pharmacology. And so we see this with pain, for instance, in THC, that there's sort of a moderate dose where you get the biggest pain benefit. And then as you go up in dose, you start losing that pain benefit. Well, I think the same thing is going on for sleep. The more recent data that came out on sleep is they were studying apnea. So, apnea is a huge sleep problem for a lot of people for a number of different reasons. And, if you're having your sleep awakened by apnea, you're at high risk for cardiovascular disease. You're going to have more inflammation in your body, higher levels of cortisol, so weight gain associated with apnea. So they thought, well, we'll study, THC for apnea. Well, they studied doses of 2, 5, and 10 milligrams and did some EEG recordings of the brain. And what they suggested, and it was a small study, it hasn't been followed up upon, is that, we have this sleep cycle that we go through 4 or 5 times across the night. And REM is when you're coming out of that deep sleep and your brain connectivity is getting back online. And what they showed was that this moderate dose of THC was actually strengthening the ultradian rhythm so that people have had better sleep rhythms across the night, less apnea. And then my clinical experience, and this is based on seeing patients since 2010 and then working almost exclusively with chronic pain patients, many of whom are women because women have more pain than men. And pain is a huge sleep disruptor. That THC is the bomb for sleep. If you smoke it, you metabolize it pretty quickly and it just goes into the fat tissue really quickly. If you take it orally, it has a longer sustained release hanging around in the bloodstream longer. So some people may use, a little bit of inhaled to help them get into sleep. But if they're having trouble staying asleep, oral cannabis, and I'm talking 2 to 4 milligrams of THC, can significantly improve sleep. And this is a lifesaver for women and women's health because it's, we were probably designed to be a mother to be easily awakened. We're on the alert to tend and defend, and feed, right, in the middle of the night. And so, we may just be lighter sleepers in general. But yeah, for that whole perimenopausal time, the menopausal transition, until women get past menopause, sometimes the sleep is just a horrible interference in their life. So just wanted to clarify that because, I think it provides a very nice harm reduction approach to other sleep medications.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that because, even though I had seen that study and Huberman, I think, repeated it in his episode, what I had found with my own little research study that I had done with the Oura Ring, and of course I was inhaling cannabis when I was trying this, I was vaporizing it through a real vaporizer, not the vape cartridges or anything. But so what I found was that if I discontinued, if I interacted with cannabis, say 10 minutes before I went to bed, right? And I wasn't going for broke or interacting with a lot of it, but I was interacting with about 1 bowl's worth, right? I would find my REM sleep was a little impaired. Now, if I waited about an hour or two and stopped and discontinued cannabis use about an hour or two before I went to bed, but still interacted with the same amount, my REM sleep was completely preserved. So what that might show is that by the time that I'm actually going to bed, I have that minimum dose in me. I'm not sure offhand, I have no idea, but, this is actually giving a lot of credence and a lot of awareness to what I was experiencing, because that's what I was telling people too, was like, hey, I know what the research says, but at the same time, I've noticed there are some inconsistencies. Like if I interact with cannabis at, say, 3 p.m., right, and then I go to bed at, say, 9 or 10, my REM sleep is completely fine. So I was like, what is the point of diminishing return? Like, what is the point at which, like, I interact with cannabis and it interferes with my REM sleep? But also, like you're saying, it's not necessarily that cannabis is interfering with REM sleep. It's more like, what is the dose? What is the heavy cannabinoid in there? Like, for instance, like, is it a hemp product? Because then I don't know what would happen in terms of, like, if I'm interacting with a low THC, does that make it worse? Like, there's so many things that it's so hard to say correlation equals causation. And I think that's the thing that frustrated me with the Huberman episode, is he was making a lot of correlations equal causation. And I'm like, that's just scary to do with science, because we don't know if next year there's going to be a study done that's done in a different manner that shows a totally different thing. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because this is the kind of stuff and the exact reason I wanted to have you on, because you have so much expertise in this realm, specifically in the science end of it too, that is so valuable right now with the explosion in cannabis, yet a very big lack of education, aside from fear mongering and things like that. That's why people like you are so necessary right now, to be able to actually say, no, this is based on actual science that I have really done, and this is what it's showing right now. I think that's amazing. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I like to call those things urban legends.
Yeah. Oh my, that's an amazing pun. I love puns with cannabis. One of my favorite ones is ideas. So we can exchange puns with cannabis for sure.
That's a good one. Yeah, ideas. So cannabis can be I think that women's health is complex. No women are alike. They've got their own genetics. They've got their own, environmental things impacting how their hormones are functioning. And, so I think it takes women finding a practitioner that they can trust, that can help them, balance hormones. THC is not necessarily going to do that. Again, THC may just be a hack. If you're really suffering from, like, for instance, that mid-cycle period, I used to call it cyclicosis. Because it was literally, for me, it was like a psychosis. Because when estrogen goes up, our monoamine oxidase is helping to metabolize estrogen. And if you're a high estrogen producer and your monoamine oxidase is now having to metabolize estrogen, you're going to have more other neurotransmitters, and you can feel very manic, hypomanic. And that's why I came to call it cyclicosis. Because then the same thing can occur as the ovaries are starting to lose their function, and that high FSH level occurs. And women can feel like they're going crazy, and, misinterpretation of signals from their partners, and, all kinds of things can go on. And so sometimes just the relief, of even a low potency inhalation of cannabis and that fast acting 5% THC to just bring you down off of that can be really appealing and, maybe even life-saving for some people. We don't know.
Absolutely. I love two things you brought up. Number one, the analogy that came to me is that, say if you have a virus on your computer, right? Well, the only way to start your computer safely is in safe mode, right? So that's kind of like the same thing as, like, kind of that hack that you were mentioning, right? Like, okay, let's put the computer into safe mode and then figure out what's going on without the virus being able to continue getting in there and, screwing up our process of trying to figure out what's going on. The second thing I really love too is the fact that you said 5% THC, because this is something that I'm so big on right now, is that we're seeing higher and higher numbers of Delta-9 THC, as if somehow people have correlated that more Delta-9 THC equals either better experience or better bang for your buck, when in reality, we know that cannabis throughout antiquity has actually been very diverse, right? Especially like classic, and the whole indica sativa hybrid thing is kind of a myth anyway these days. It's much more terpene driven. But if you look at plants that are grown in the equatorial regions versus more of the plants that are grown in mountainous regions, they had very different effects. And so it's very interesting to see that with the kind of mass hybridization that's happening with cannabis, we're actually losing a lot of the differentiality we have between cannabis. And that differentiality could be the things that we're actually really helping in the human experience, both for males and females, that now we're just generalizing into one category of how pretty does your cannabis flower look. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hybridization has, caused a loss of biodiversity. I mean, that's been shown in large data sets. I know that were done here in California of, chemotypes, and that they didn't really separate out. The only ones that separated out were Jack Herrera, because it was a high terpinolene, Blue Dream, because it was a high pinene chemotype, and then the CBDs, but they separated out because of the CBD content. So everything else was mostly just alike. There's all these names, but the industry is not showing us those terpene profiles. And so we don't get to make that informed choice about what we want to use. We have to go based on whatever name they want to name it. And that doesn't, or what, calling it a hybrid or an indica or a sativa, which is pretty well proven not to describe much anymore.
Exactly. And it's funny, I think Phylos did and Phylos has a little bit of an interesting history. They may or may not have sold a lot of information to Monsanto, but what they did show was that so many people thought they had Triangle Kush or whatever. And it was really like just 5 or 6 different chemotypes all being labeled different things, and so it's very interesting you say that too. And, one of the things, I know we're getting close to the end here, but I want to really talk about the Green Women's Guide, because I imagine, right, that for a lot of women listening, they're like, oh my goodness, there's so much to know here, right? And there's so much to learn. But I imagine you've simplified the process and putting all of the need to knows in there. And so I'd love if you could go over a little bit of what type of women would benefit from this. I imagine probably most of them, right? But what type of women benefit from this? And then a little bit of what's in there and what they can expect from that, because this is something that I am so excited to help you move out, because, this is something that's so needed. And again, I'm a male, right? So I do a totally different thing. I help people figure out if cannabis is actually right for them in their lives. You're doing it specifically for women, which is so needed. So if you could go over some of those things, I would love that.
Yeah, so I put it together for women across the lifespan, because by the time I put it together, I had crossed the lifespan. And so I'm almost 62, so I'm postmenopausal, and just want to say to any women or men listening that it's the best time of life for women when the hormones are not going up and down anymore. So yeah, I start out with talking about its role in foreplay, and then I go into what we sort of touched upon and development of a baby in the womb, and these effects on cycling. And so it's just more of a deeper dive into that. And then if we go outside of reproduction, then we have all of these other women's health problems, that women experience more irritable bowel syndrome than men. Women can have, heavy bleeding. They can have horrible cramps every month, other PMS symptoms. They can have depression. So endometriosis, ovarian cysts. I mean, there's all kinds of things that get touched upon. The research is small, but I tried to touch upon how might cannabis be an herbal ally in some of those situations. And I try to also, I've always considered that cannabis was going to be a gateway herb for, people who maybe never really thought about botanical medicine, that if they got interested in cannabis, they were going to become interested in other plant medicines. So I do go into sort of more naturopathic and holistic and other botanicals, that can benefit women's health. And then wrap it up with, the perimenopause and the menopausal time of life, which I think is the best time of life to use cannabis, because now you don't have to worry about, am I being a good mother or not? There's this big question, can cannabis users be good mothers? Of course they can. And, I'm not going to get pregnant. I don't have to worry about that. What about my cognition? There's actually data, again, that low dose THC may be neuroprotective and favor, helping cognition along. So, it's all about dose. And that's the big overview of the entire course.
Oh, I love that so much, and it's really cool because, what I found is that a lot of women are in need of this stuff, right? Like you said, the research is slim, but it's still out there and it's coming out more and more now as cannabis becomes destigmatized. And I think it is the perfect time to have these types of resources on hand because, again, informed consent, right? Like, how do we know we're making the right choice for us if we don't have all the information handy? And so I think this is absolutely amazing. And Dr. Michelle, this has been incredible. I really want to have you back on to discuss more things regarding cannabis science because this is a realm that, I've gotten into over the past 5 years, and I'm always looking to learn more and more. And I learned a lot today, I imagine, as all the listeners did too. And I'll make sure to put all of this in the show notes too. But where can people find you? Where can they find the Green Woman's Guide? Of course, like I said, it'll be in the show notes. But if you have a website or anything like that, how can the people find you?
Well, greenwomansguide.com is the website. And of course, they would want to use your code. I know you have a code so they can get a discount. And, I really suggest the course not only for cannabis enthusiasts, but, when I'm giving education, I'm really thinking about women that don't have access to cannabis, but, like you said, they're curious, but they're looking for accurate information. And so I'm hoping that's the niche I can fill. So, if you have a mother or a sister who doesn't know anything about cannabis, you can gift it to them because that's really the population. I'm not trying to hit people who already know everything about cannabis necessarily. I'm really trying to educate the people that may not know or have access to good information.
I love that.
So I'm on Instagram. It's just Dr. Michelle Sexton. So I'm always putting posts up there about some of the content, to just kind of pique interest in that. And my website is just msextonnd.com. And so some of my research is there and some of the other talks that I've given. So I'd love to have anybody visit, sign up for my mailing list, or just follow me on Instagram. That'd be great.
Oh, I love that. It's so cool because I say it all the time, like with federal legalization on the horizon and cannabis, becoming more and more destigmatized, there are going to be so many people out there that just need like basic info. Like, do I smoke it or do I eat it? Why does it feel stronger when I eat it? Like the things that people like you or I imagine many people listening to the show right now might think are common knowledge, but they're not. I mean, when I first came out with Connect Cannabis, I put a lot of science in there and a lot of people were hitting me up saying like, hey, this is like too complex. And so I had to simplify it. And I was thinking like, oh, I'll put all this stuff in there, not realizing like, well, Ryan, you've had a long time to be passionate about this. And so like the new information you put in there was not overwhelming to you, but to someone who's never heard even endocannabinoid science before, or, what cannabinoids versus terpenes versus flavonoids are, any of this stuff, that is crazy. And so I love that you're appealing to this demographic because not only do women need this, but especially a lot of women that have not interacted with cannabis before and are just hearing a lot about it and are curious, like, is this right for me? Is this something that could benefit from me? Is my daughter using this? Could this be something that I help her with or connect with her on or any of these things? So I love that. And Michelle, my last question for you is this, and I ask this to everyone who goes to the show, which is, say someone listens to this conversation, and especially a woman, right? And they're really excited to try out cannabis in their own life. What would be the one piece of advice you would suggest to allow them to properly discern if cannabis is right for them in their lives?
Well, I use the analogy of peppers, that cannabis is like peppers. And, some people like really hot peppers and other people don't, but you can develop the ability to tolerate hot peppers if you use them over time and introduce them slowly. So, hemp being the bell pepper variety, I think is always a great place to start because, you can get this higher ratio of CBD to THC and maybe get a little taste of, how THC could feel in your body without having to have a worry that you're going to get some sort of an overdose or too much of it that you don't like. And it's not everybody's medicine, and so if it's not for you, no shame. You know, we all have our own medicines that work for us. But I think introducing it, you know, very slowly and at low dose is particularly important, because if you just hand somebody a 10 milligram edible and think that that's for everybody, you're wrong. And yeah, that person may never use it again, where it might have been a beneficial medicine for them. So, you know, using it, understanding how to use it wisely, I think is the most important thing. And you may do that little dose and it's still not for you. And that's fine. At least you didn't have an uncomfortable or a dysphoric experience.
Yes, I love that. You know, I talk about this often. I'm like, it is, you know, for everyone that interacts with cannabis, and this is what I teach all my coaches in the program about, is like, it's up to us to be able to tell people, like, hey, go low and slow. You can always take more, you know, after you've waited a certain hour and a half if you're eating it, or after about 20 minutes if you're inhaling it. But it's really hard to counteract it once you've already ingested it. There are some ways, like with black pepper kernels or CBD or breathing, but you don't want to have to go there, because that could potentially traumatize someone. And then that person could be at the next public hearing saying, I tried this plant and it's the devil, right? Or whatever the hell follows next, right? And so it really is up to all of us to make sure that we're practicing harm reduction, minimum effective dosing, so that the laws continue opening up, the research continues to get done, and we don't fall into the archetype of what I imagine a lot of people want us to be, right? Which is the lazy stoner, the irresponsible person, all these things that are complete falsehoods. But every time that one of us does something like that without knowing, we potentially strengthen that archetype that we don't want to be seen as anymore. And so it's so important at this time in history to be on the right side of history.
Good point.
Well, yeah. Well, Michelle, you know, like I stated in the intro, you're an absolute juggernaut when it comes to the role cannabis can play in women's health. And I imagine after listening to this episode that it is easy to tell why I wanted you to come on the show and discuss this subject in depth. Like I also stated in the intro, guys, Dr. Michelle has an amazing course, The Green Woman's Guide, that any of you who are ready to buy the ticket and take the ride into her world can do so today by hopping down to the show notes of this episode, and have the opportunity to save 25% by using the coupon code Highly Optimized. Dr. Michelle, thank you so much for doing the amazing work you're doing in the world that is so needed at this time in history, and also for taking the time to share your expertise and experience in this realm on the show today. And until next time, my friend, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.